In Silicon Valley's most exclusive boardroom, a seemingly submissive housewife was about to shatter every assumption about power. What started as a dinner party took a shocking turn when she faced her husband's public humiliation. Isabella Rodriguez wasn't your typical tech wife. For 5 years, she had hidden behind supportive smiles, known for apparent disinterest in complicated business matters. When Richard called her too stupid for investment talk, Isabella revealed documents proving she owned 60% of his firm. What began as silent sacrifice would become Silicon Valley's most explosive power reversal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Isabella Rodriguez balanced the coffee tray with practiced ease as she navigated the glass doors of Blackwell Strategic's conference room. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table where 6 men in expensive suits discussed quarterly projections with the casual confidence of those who'd never questioned their right to be there. "Coffee's here," she announced softly, her voice carrying just enough warmth to seem genuinely helpful without interrupting the flow of conversation. Richard looked up from his presentation slides with the indulgent smile he reserved for her public appearances. Part gratitude, part condescension, wholly patronizing. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said, accepting his cup with the brief, distracted attention one might give a well-trained service dog. "You're an angel." Isabella's smile never wavered as she distributed the remaining cups, though her mind was already dissecting the presentation Richard had been stumbling through for the past 20 minutes. Market volatility predictions, consumer behavior analytics, revenue optimization strategies. The very fields where she had once commanded rooms twice this size, where her algorithms had predicted market trends with surgical precision, where venture capitalists had competed for her attention like moths drawn to flame. She settled into the chair Richard had positioned for her in the corner, close enough to appear supportive, far enough to be forgotten, the perfect vantage point to observe without being observed, to think without being expected to speak. As you can see from slide 12, Richard continued, his voice gaining confidence now that his wife had fulfilled her domestic duty and retreated to her designated space. Our predictive modeling suggests a 15% uptick in the healthcare consulting sector. Isabella's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Slide 12 showed a graph that any first-year business student could spot as fundamentally flawed. The data correlation was weak, the sample size insufficient, and the seasonal adjustments completely ignored the Q4 anomalies that had been making headlines for months. She had identified the market opportunity 6 months ago, had quietly suggested it to Richard over dinner using carefully casual language that wouldn't threaten his expertise. He dismissed it then as women's intuition rather than strategic thinking. Now watching him present her insight as his own discovery while simultaneously butchering the analysis, she felt the familiar burn of suppressed frustration in her chest. Trevor Williams, Richard's COO and closest friend since their Harvard MBA days, leaned forward with the kind of focused attention that had made him invaluable to their firm. "The numbers look promising, but I'm curious about our funding capacity for this expansion. Our mystery investor has been generous, but we're talking about a significant capital commitment here." "IR Holdings has shown consistent faith in our vision," Richard replied smoothly, though Isabella caught the slight tension around his eyes. He still didn't understand why their anonymous benefactor had chosen them. Still felt the imposter syndrome that kept him awake some nights wondering when the money would dry up. If only he knew that IR Holdings' investment decisions were made from the home office he thought she used for online shopping and charity work. If only he knew that every mysterious infusion of capital had come after she'd spent sleepless nights reviewing their books, identifying opportunities, and calculating precisely how much support they needed to survive their next growth phase. "Have we learned anything more about IR Holdings' background?" asked James Chen, the newest partner. "It's unusual for an investor to maintain this level of anonymity, especially with the amounts we're discussing." Isabella forced herself to remain perfectly still, though every instinct screamed at her to speak. She knew more about IR Holdings than anyone in this room could imagine. She was IR Holdings, a shell company she'd established 3 months after their wedding, when it became clear that Richard's firm was hemorrhaging money faster than his pride would allow him to admit. "Our investor values privacy," Richard said, with the kind of authoritative certainty that brooked no further questions. "Some people prefer to let their capital speak rather than their personalities." Trevor made a note on his legal pad, and Isabella found herself wondering, not for the first time, exactly what he was documenting. His analytical mind was both an asset and a potential threat. Too much curiosity could lead to uncomfortable discoveries. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with Richard fielding questions about market penetration strategies and competitive analysis. Isabella listened with the divided attention of someone performing a careful balancing act, engaged enough to support her husband, detached enough to maintain the fiction that none of this was her area of expertise. When the clients finally departed with handshakes and promises to circle back by Friday, Isabella began collecting empty coffee cups with the efficient movements of someone who'd perfected the art of invisible service. "That went well," Richard said, loosening his tie with visible relief. "Chen seems particularly interested in the healthcare projections." "Your presentation was very thorough," Isabella offered, choosing her words with surgical precision. She'd learned that compliments about his thoroughness were safe. They suggested admiration without implying superior knowledge. "Although," she continued carefully, "I noticed some of the seasonality data seemed a bit—" "Sweetheart," Richard interrupted with gentle firmness, "I know you mean well, but numbers and strategy are pretty complex. These models take years of experience to understand properly." The words hit her like a physical blow, though she absorbed them with the same practiced grace she'd cultivated over 5 years of marriage. Years of watching her insights dismissed as lucky guesses. Years of seeing her strategic thinking attributed to feminine intuition rather than the Harvard MBA and MIT computer science degree that she'd earned before he'd ever met her. "Of course," she said softly, "I was just curious." "And that's what I love about you," Richard said, crossing to drop a kiss on her forehead. "Always interested in learning, but leave the heavy lifting to those of us who've been doing this for a while, okay?" Isabella nodded and smiled, the same serene expression she'd perfected for board meetings, where she'd been the youngest person and often the only woman in rooms full of skeptical investors. The expression that had once masked revolutionary thinking now concealed a different kind of revolution, the slow burn of resentment that grew stronger each time her husband explained her own field of expertise back to her. After Richard left for lunch with Trevor, Isabella retreated to what he called her craft room, the converted bedroom where she maintained the elaborate fiction of her domestic life. Yoga mats and art supplies occupied the visible spaces, but behind a false panel that Richard had never thought to investigate lay her real workspace: 3 monitors, a secure internet connection, and filing cabinets containing 5 years of financial records that would reshape her husband's understanding of his own success. She pulled up the latest quarterly reports for IR Holdings, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the fluid competence of someone who'd once coded machine learning algorithms that Wall Street firms now paid millions to license. The numbers told a story that Richard couldn't see, or perhaps couldn't bear to see. Her initial investment of $3 million had grown to $15 million in strategic funding over the past 5 years. Blackwell Strategic's valuation had increased by 300%.
Their client roster had expanded from 12 companies to 47, and their annual revenue had grown from barely sustainable to genuinely profitable. All of it built on her money, her analysis, her strategic vision, carefully disguised as coincidental market timing and Richard's improving business acumen. Isabella leaned back in her chair and stared at the numbers that represented both her greatest achievement and her deepest betrayal. Of herself, if not of him. She'd told herself she was investing in their future, supporting the man she loved, building something together even if he couldn't acknowledge her contribution. But sitting in that conference room today, watching him dismiss her expertise while benefiting from her secret support, she'd felt something shift. A hairline crack in the careful structure she'd built around their marriage. The dinner party was tomorrow night. Catherine Stone, the venture capitalist who'd been courting their firm for months, Richard's father, Gregory, down from Portland for one of his rare visits, and Sophia, her former business partner, who'd been asking increasingly pointed questions about Isabella's transformation from Silicon Valley powerhouse to supportive housewife. Isabella closed the financial reports and locked them away, but the numbers lingered in her mind like an equation that refused to balance. She'd built an empire from shadows, wielded power through careful anonymity, and supported a marriage that required her to diminish herself daily. Tomorrow night, she sensed that carefully constructed balance might finally shift. The question was whether she'd be ready when it did. The familiar hiss of the espresso machine at Coupa Cafe provided cover for conversations that shouldn't be overheard. Isabella arrived first, choosing their old corner table, the same spot where she and Sophia had once sketched algorithms on napkins and dreamed of disrupting entire industries. Now she sat alone, watching Palo Alto's tech emit through rain-streaked windows, feeling like a ghost haunting her former life. Sophia Nakamura entered with the same commanding presence that made venture capitalists take notice when she was barely 30. Tailored blazer, confident stride, the kind of purposeful energy that Isabella remembered possessing once, before she'd traded her identity for love. "You look tired," Sophia said without preamble, settling into the chair across from her former partner. No politeness, no small talk. The directness that had made their partnership so effective now felt like a scalpel, cutting through Isabella's carefully maintained facade. "Richard had an early meeting. I've been up since 5 preparing." The lie came easily now, though Isabella had once prided herself on brutal honesty. She'd been up since 5 reviewing market forecasts and adjusting IR Holdings' investment strategies, work that would have impressed Sophia if Isabella could have claimed it as her own.
Sophia pulled out her phone, swiping to a photo from 3 years ago. "Do you remember this?" Isabella's breath caught. The image showed her at TechCrunch Disrupt, standing behind a podium with the kind of electric confidence that commanded attention. She was explaining machine learning applications to a room full of skeptical investors, her hands moving with passionate precision as she outlined revolutionary algorithms that would later sell for $50 million. "You were magnificent that day," Sophia said quietly. "You had Goldman Sachs eating out of your hand by lunch." "That was a long time ago." Isabella's voice barely carried over the cafe's ambient noise. 3 years. That's not ancient history." Sophia leaned forward. "Where is she, Isabella? Where's the woman who told those venture capitalists they were thinking too small?" Isabella's phone buzzed. Richard's name appeared on the screen, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that accompanied his calls during her rare personal time. "I should take this." "Don't." But Isabella was already answering, her voice automatically shifting to the softer, more deferential tone that Richard expected. "Hi, honey." "There you are, having fun playing businesswoman with Sophia?" His chuckle held no malice, but the condescension was unmistakable. Even Sophia could hear it. "Just catching up. Don't forget about tonight's prep. Catherine Stone is expecting perfection, and I need you focused on making a good impression." Isabella watched Sophia's expression harden as Richard's voice carried through the speaker. The same woman who'd once negotiated multi-million-dollar deals was being reminded to smile pretty for company. "Of course. I'll be home soon." After she hung up, Sophia's silence stretched between them like an accusation. "He talks to you like you're his assistant. He's under pressure." "Stop." Sophia's voice cut through Isabella's excuse with surgical precision. "Either you remember who you are, or I'll remind everyone else for you." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke, and Isabella realized her carefully constructed world was beginning to burn. Trevor Williams remained in the conference room long after the others had left, spreadsheets glowing on his laptop screen like digital tea leaves that might reveal the future. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting his shadow across financial documents that told a story he was only beginning to understand. IR Holdings, the mysterious benefactor who'd appeared exactly when Blackwell Strategic needed salvation most. Trevor had always prided himself on reading between the lines, on finding patterns where others saw coincidence. His Harvard professors had called it analytical intuition. His ex-wife had called it obsession. Tonight, staring at 5 years of perfectly timed investments, he was beginning to think she'd been right about the obsession part. The shell company's funding pattern was too precise, too responsive to their internal needs. When they'd lost the Morrison account 3 years ago, a disaster that should have bankrupted them, IR Holdings had materialized with exactly the right amount to cover payroll and rent. When Richard had pitched the healthcare expansion last quarter, funding appeared within weeks, as if someone had been listening to their private conversations. Trevor pulled up the Delaware Incorporation records on his second monitor. IR Holdings, LLC, registered agent, a law firm in Wilmington that specialized in corporate anonymity, beneficial owner, protected by multiple layers of legal encryption that would take months to unravel. But who needed months when you had late-night access to your own company's financial records? Working late again? Trevor looked up to find Jasmine Harper standing in the doorway, her arms full of files that needed Richard's signature. At 26, she was the kind of quietly efficient assistant who noticed everything and revealed nothing, a combination that had made her invaluable, and Trevor was beginning to realize, potentially dangerous. "Just reviewing some investor relations materials," he said, minimizing the IR Holdings screen with practiced casualness. Jasmine approached his desk with the fluid confidence of someone comfortable in spaces where others might feel intimidated. "The Stone meeting has everyone on edge. Richard seems particularly nervous about making the right impression." Something in her tone made Trevor look up more carefully. Jasmine had been with the firm for 2 years, long enough to witness their transformation from struggling startup to profitable consultancy, long enough to notice patterns. "Have you ever wondered about our timing?" he asked, testing the waters. "How so?" "The way opportunities seem to find us, the way funding appears exactly when we need it." He studied her expression, looking for tells. "Some might call it luck." Jasmine set down her files with deliberate precision. "I've worked for 3 different firms since graduating. You learn to recognize the difference between luck and other factors." The careful pause before other factors told Trevor everything he needed to know. She'd been thinking about this too. What kind of other factors?
The kind where someone cares enough about a company's survival to watch it very, very carefully. Jasmine's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The kind where investment decisions get made based on intimate knowledge of internal operations. Trevor felt the familiar thrill of pieces clicking into place. "You've noticed the timing too." "I've noticed a lot of things, like how Mrs. Blackwell's simple questions about business operations often reveal sophisticated understanding of market dynamics." Jasmine glanced toward the door, ensuring they remained alone. "Like how she deflects credit for insights that turn out to be remarkably prescient." "You think Isabella?" "I think tomorrow night's dinner party might be more interesting than anyone realizes, especially if certain people start asking the right questions about IR Holdings." Trevor stared at her, realizing that his investigation had just gained an unexpected ally, or a dangerous competitor. The game was changing, and Isabella Rodriguez had no idea that her carefully constructed anonymity was about to shatter. Isabella stood before her walk-in closet, fingering the fabric of a midnight blue Armani dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Richard assumed her designer wardrobe came from his growing success, never questioning how a woman with no head for business had developed such expensive taste. Tonight she chose each piece deliberately, the dress that whispered wealth without shouting it, the Cartier watch that suggested old money, and the confidence that came from knowing she could buy and sell everyone at the table. If only she were allowed to use it. "You look beautiful," Richard said, adjusting his tie in the mirror behind her. "Catherine Stone is going to be impressed." Isabella smiled, the same practice expression that once charmed investors into writing 8-figure checks. "I hope so. This could be important for the firm." "Let's not worry about business tonight," Richard replied, kissing her temple. "Just focus on being your charming self. Leave the strategic thinking to me." The words stung with familiar precision, but Isabella merely nodded as the doorbell announced their first arrival. Gregory Blackwell entered with the measured confidence of a man who'd built and sold 2 companies before his son had finished elementary school. His embrace held genuine warmth, but Isabella caught him studying her with the sharp attention of someone who noticed details others missed. "Isabella, you look lovely as always." Gregory's voice carried undertones she couldn't quite read. "I'm looking forward to meeting this Catherine Stone I've heard so much about." Catherine arrived 20 minutes later. Her presence immediately shifted the room's energy. She moved with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to making million-dollar decisions before dessert, her handshake firm enough to crush assumptions about feminine weakness. "Mrs. Blackwell," Catherine said, her gaze lingering on Isabella longer than social courtesy required. "Your husband speaks very highly of your support for his work." "I try to stay out of his way," Isabella replied automatically, the self-deprecating response that usually ended such conversations. But Catherine's smile sharpened. "How refreshing. So many wives insist on meddling in areas beyond their expertise." Sophia arrived fashionably late, her eyes immediately finding Isabella's across the crowded living room. The look they shared carried 5 years of history and the weight of yesterday's ultimatum. Warning and promise combined. Trevor entered last, carrying a leather portfolio that made Isabella's stomach tighten with inexplicable dread. Whatever documents he'd brought for Catherine's review, she sensed they would complicate her carefully orchestrated evening. "Shall we?" Richard gestured toward the dining room, his voice carrying the nervous energy of a man whose entire future might be decided over wine and carefully prepared talking points. As they moved toward dinner, Isabella felt the converging forces of her hidden life pressing against the brittle shell of her public persona. Tonight, she realized, something would break. The only question was whether it would be her secret or her sanity. The dining room fell into expectant silence as Richard stood, his presentation materials spread across the mahogany table like battle plans. Catherine Stone watched with the predatory attention of someone who'd made her fortune distinguishing between substance and sales pitch. "As you can see from our Q3 projections," Richard began, his voice gaining confidence as he moved through familiar territory, "we're positioned to capture significant market share in the emerging healthcare analytics sector." Isabella noticed the flaw immediately, a fundamental misunderstanding of current Medicare reimbursement rates that would invalidate his entire cost-benefit analysis. She corrected the same error in her private review last week, had even left her notes strategically placed where Richard might find them. He'd apparently missed them entirely. "The volatility metrics seem aggressive," Catherine observed, her tone carrying the sharp edge of someone who'd spotted blood in the water, "given the current regulatory environment." Richard's smile faltered slightly. "I'm confident our projections account for market fluctuations." Isabella felt her chest tighten as he doubled down on flawed data. She watched Catherine's expression shift from interested to skeptical, saw Gregory's concerned glance in her direction. The room's energy was shifting, and not in Richard's favor. "Actually," Isabella said softly, her voice barely audible above the dinner conversation, "wouldn't the new CMS guidelines affect those calculations? The reimbursement structure changed last month." The words escaped before she could stop them, drawn out by 5 years of watching her insights dismissed while inferior analysis took center stage. Her expertise bleeding through the carefully maintained facade of ignorance. Richard's expression transformed from surprise to mortification to anger in the space of a heartbeat. The silence stretched until it became painful, everyone suddenly aware they were witnessing something more intimate and dangerous than a business presentation gone wrong. "Sweetheart," Richard said, his voice carrying the strained patience of someone explaining basics to a child, "I appreciate your interest, but healthcare finance is incredibly complex. These are graduate-level economic principles that take years of study to understand properly." Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly.
Gregory's mouth formed a thin line of disapproval. "Isabella's too stupid for investment talk anyway," Richard continued, with a forced laugh that landed like a slap. "Let's leave the heavy thinking to those of us who actually understand these markets." The words hung in the air like poison gas, toxic and inescapable. Catherine's expression shifted to disgust. Gregory looked appalled. Sophia's eyes blazed with fury as she half rose from her chair. But it was Isabella's reaction that shattered the evening, a single moment of naked pain before her expression went completely blank, all emotion draining from her face like water from a broken vessel. The perfect silence that followed carried the weight of a marriage imploding in real time. Isabella excused herself from the table with the same serene composure she'd once used to navigate hostile boardrooms. Her footsteps on the hardwood floor were measured, deliberate, the sound of someone walking toward a precipice with full knowledge of what came next. She returned 5 minutes later, carrying a leather briefcase that none of them had ever seen before, setting it on the dining table with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb. The room's tension shifted, becoming electric with the promise of secrets about to be revealed. "Since we're discussing investment strategies," Isabella said, her voice carrying a new quality, the controlled authority of someone who'd commanded rooms full of skeptical billionaires, "perhaps you'd like to meet IR Holdings' managing partner." Catherine leaned forward with renewed interest. Gregory's expression sharpened. Richard looked confused, still processing the shift in his wife's demeanor from wounded silence to something far more dangerous. Isabella opened the briefcase and withdrew a folder marked with the IR Holdings logo. "Incorporation documents," she said, placing the first set of papers before Catherine. "Filed in Delaware, March 2019, 6 months after our wedding." Richard's face went pale as Catherine examined the documents, her expression transforming from curiosity to amazement. "Sole beneficial owner," Catherine read aloud, "Isabella Rodriguez." The words hit the table like grenades. Trevor's mouth fell open. Sophia sat back with grim satisfaction. Gregory's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "That's impossible," Richard whispered. Isabella withdrew a second folder, this one thick with financial statements and bank records. $15 million in strategic investments over 5 years. Initial capitalization from the sale of AI Dynamics to Google Ventures. March 2019. $50 million transaction. She placed the Google acquisition documents on the table with surgical precision, each page a nail in the coffin of Richard's assumptions about her intelligence and his own success. "You sold a company to Google?" Catherine's voice carried the kind of respect reserved for entrepreneurs who'd achieved the impossible. "AI-driven market analytics platform," Isabella replied, matter-of-factly. "Revolutionary predictive algorithms for consumer behavior modeling. The same technology that's been driving your firm's recent strategic insights." Richard stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. His entire worldview was crumbling in real time, each revelation rewriting everything he thought he knew about his wife, his success, his identity. "The healthcare analytics opportunity you just presented," Isabella continued with relentless calm, "I identified it 8 months ago. The timing, the market positioning, the competitive analysis, all developed through proprietary algorithms I created before we met." Catherine was studying the financial records with the focused attention of someone recognizing genius when she saw it. "These investment patterns, you've been essentially running Blackwell Strategic from behind the scenes." "I've been supporting my husband's vision while protecting my own privacy, until tonight, when he made it clear that my contributions aren't valued." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard sat frozen, his presentation materials suddenly looking like finger paintings next to Isabella's documentation of real expertise and financial power. "So when you said I was too stupid for investment talk,"
Isabella said quietly. "You were speaking to the woman who's been funding your entire operation." The game had changed. Permanently. 3 days after the revelation, Richard sat in his office staring at documents that redefined his entire existence. Isabella's financial records spread across his desk told the story of a marriage built on deception and a business empire founded on his wife's hidden genius. Every success he'd claimed, every strategic breakthrough he'd celebrated, had been orchestrated by the woman he'd publicly humiliated as too stupid for investment talk.
The guest bedroom had become Isabella's domain now, her designer clothes hanging in the adjacent closet like artifacts from a life they'd both been pretending to live. She worked from there with quiet efficiency, fielding calls from venture capitalists who'd somehow learned her identity overnight. Word traveled fast in Silicon Valley, especially when it involved a tech prodigy hiding in plain sight. "She played us all," Trevor said, entering without knocking, a liberty that spoke to their friendship's new fragility. 5 years of perfectly timed investments, strategic insights delivered as casual suggestions, algorithms that revolutionized our approach to client analytics. How did we miss it? Richard's laugh held no humor. Because I couldn't see past my own ego. I actually convinced myself that my wife, who sold a company to Google for $50 million, was learning about business from me. The office door opened again to admit Catherine Stone, who had requested this emergency meeting after spending 2 days conducting her own investigation into Isabella's background. Her expression carried the kind of predatory interest that made Richard's stomach clench with dread. "I've been reviewing every interaction I've had with your firm," Catherine said without preamble. "Every strategic recommendation, every market insight, every predictive model that made Blackwell Strategic worth my attention. They all trace back to her, don't they?" Richard could only nod, the scope of his self-deception finally becoming clear. "I want to invest. $15 million, controlling interest. But I'm negotiating with Isabella, not you." Trevor's sharp intake of breath echoed Richard's own shock. "Catherine, you can't just—" "Actually, I can. Your mystery investor owns 60% of this company. She has majority control, which means every decision you've made for the past 5 years required her implicit approval." Catherine's smile held no warmth. "The question is whether she'll keep you around after the way you've treated her." The implications hit Richard like physical blows. Not only had he been dependent on Isabella's financial support, but she'd had the power to remove him from his own company at any time. She'd chosen to remain hidden, to let him maintain the illusion of leadership while she pulled the strings from shadows. Gregory entered then, having flown down from Portland after the dinner party's explosive conclusion. His expression carried the disappointed authority of a father forced to confront his son's fundamental character flaws. "I've been thinking about your mother, how I dismissed her insights about the Portland expansion, how I treated her suggestions as cute rather than strategic." His voice carried decades of regret. "I taught you to diminish women's intelligence, Richard, and you perfected the lesson." "Dad, I never meant—" "You meant exactly what you said. You've been treating your wife like a child while she's been running your company." Gregory's words cut with surgical precision. "The question now is whether you're capable of growth or if she's better off without you." Richard stared at the financial documents that documented 5 years of Isabella's invisible support. The woman he had married was a stranger, brilliant, powerful, and patient enough to hide her true self for love. The woman he had become was someone he'd barely recognized. The choice ahead seemed impossible: swallow his pride completely or lose everything that mattered. The Blackwell Strategic Conference Room had never felt smaller. Isabella sat at the head of the mahogany table, her rightful place as majority shareholder finally claimed, while the future of everything she had built hung in the balance. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating documents that would reshape the company's entire power structure. Richard occupied the chair where she had once sat as the supportive wife, his usual confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of a man whose identity had been surgically removed. Trevor fidgeted with his legal pad, caught between loyalty to his friend and recognition of Isabella's superior business acumen. Catherine Stone watched the proceedings with the focused attention of a predator sensing opportunity. "We're here," Isabella began, her voice carrying the authoritative calm she had once used to command boardrooms full of skeptical investors, "to determine the future leadership structure of Blackwell Strategic. As majority shareholder, I have 3 options to present." She opened a leather portfolio with deliberate precision, each movement calculated to demonstrate the control she had always possessed but never wielded openly. Option 1, I liquidate my holdings entirely, sell my 60% stake to an outside buyer, and walk away. The firm survives, but under new ownership with questionable commitment to current employees and client relationships. Richard's face went white. Trevor's pen stopped moving. Even Catherine looked surprised by the nuclear option. Option 2. I restructure the company with myself as CEO and majority decision-maker. Richard transitions to a subordinate role, probably heading client relations where his interpersonal skills could still provide value. This preserves the business while acknowledging the actual source of strategic direction. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Richard stared at his hands, probably calculating how completely his world had inverted. The man who explained business basics to his wife was facing demotion to junior status in the company she had been secretly running.
Option 3, Isabella continued, her tone softening slightly. We build something new, a genuine partnership based on honesty and mutual respect. Richard publicly acknowledges my contributions and role in the company's success. We restructure as co-CEOs with clearly defined responsibilities that play to our actual strengths, rather than traditional gender assumptions. Catherine leaned forward with renewed interest. And if he refuses? Then I'd choose option 1 or 2. Isabella's response carried no emotion, just business logic. I've spent 5 years hiding my capabilities to protect his ego. That ends today, regardless of which direction we take. Richard finally looked up, his expression raw with shame and something that might have been recognition. I don't deserve option 3. No, Isabella agreed quietly. You don't. But marriages aren't about deserving. They're about choosing to grow together or apart. Trevor cleared his throat hesitantly. If I may, the strategic insights that have driven our success, they've all come from you, haven't they? The healthcare expansion, the predictive analytics platform, even the client acquisition strategies. Yes, Isabella's simple acknowledgement carried the weight of 5 years of hidden contributions, along with the funding, risk assessment, and long-term planning that kept us profitable while Richard focused on relationship management. Catherine's smile sharpened. Then my investment decision is simple. I'm putting $15 million into this company, but only if Isabella leads strategic operations. Her track record speaks for itself. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the documents outlining option 3. If I agree to this, to public acknowledgement of your role, to genuine partnership, can we rebuild what we've broken? Isabella steadied her husband's face, searching for authentic remorse beneath the damaged pride. 5 years of diminished identity weighed against the possibility of something real and equal. It depends, she said finally, on whether you can love the woman I actually am instead of the one you needed me to pretend to be. The future of their marriage and business hung in the air, waiting for Richard's choice between ego and evolution. 6 weeks after the board meeting, Isabella sat across from Richard in Dr. Sarah Chen's therapy office, the neutral space where they'd been deconstructing 5 years of toxic patterns with surgical precision. The leather chairs faced each other at careful angles, close enough for intimacy, far enough apart to prevent the physical comfort that might mask emotional distance. I want to understand something, Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the measured calm of someone accustomed to navigating relationship minefields. Richard, when you called Isabella too stupid for investment talk, what were you really trying to protect? Richard's answer came slowly, each word extracted like shrapnel from an old wound. My sense of worth, I think. If she was the brilliant one, the successful one, then what was I? What did I bring to our marriage besides my need to feel important? Isabella watched her husband's profile, noting the genuine pain in his admission. 6 weeks of therapy had stripped away his defensive mechanisms, revealing the insecurity that had driven his need to diminish her. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it explained the pathology behind it. And, Isabella, Dr. Chen continued, when you chose to hide your achievements and fund his company secretly, what were you protecting? His love. I was terrified that if he knew who I really was, how successful I'd been, how much money I had, he'd feel intimidated or emasculated. I thought I was being generous by making myself smaller. But you were also lying to him about who you were. The words hit Isabella like cold water. She'd spent months focusing on Richard's dismissive behavior while avoiding her own role in creating their dysfunction. Her deception was well-intentioned, but ultimately patronizing. She decided what Richard could handle without giving him the chance to prove her wrong. I was, she admitted quietly. I assumed he couldn't handle my success, which was its own form of condescension. Their homework assignments had been brutal but necessary. Richard spent 2 weeks researching Isabella's professional achievements, reading every article about AI Dynamics acquisition, every interview where venture capitalists praised her vision. The woman he'd married wasn't just successful, she was revolutionary, a pioneer who'd changed how entire industries approach data analytics. Isabella's assignment had been equally challenging, examining why she'd been willing to erase herself for love. The answer lay buried in childhood memories of her mother, brilliant but constantly deferring to her father's ego, making herself invisible to keep peace in their home. The staff meeting last week, Dr. Chen prompted. How did that feel for both of you? Richard's public acknowledgement of Isabella's role had been the most difficult moment of his professional life. Standing before employees who'd seen him as the company's visionary leader, he'd explained that their strategic success had actually been driven by his wife's hidden contributions. The room's stunned silence had been painful but necessary. Humbling, Richard said, but also honest for the first time in years. Isabella had watched him deliver the speech with a mixture of vindication and sympathy. His willingness to sacrifice his professional image for their relationship's future had been the first genuine sign that change was possible.
The restructuring had proceeded with surprising smoothness. Isabella assumed the CEO title officially, while Richard transitioned to President of Client Relations, a role that leveraged his genuine strengths in relationship building while acknowledging her strategic superiority. Trevor had adapted to the new hierarchy with analytical pragmatism, while Jasmine earned a promotion to Strategic Operations Manager, her loyalty and discretion finally receiving proper recognition. Catherine's investment had formalized Isabella's emergence from shadows. $15 million in funding came with the expectation that Isabella would speak at industry conferences, join startup advisory boards, and reclaim her position as a visible leader in Silicon Valley's tech ecosystem. The most difficult part, Isabella told Dr. Chen, is learning to take up space again. 5 years of making myself smaller created habits that are hard to break. She'd given her first public presentation the previous week, explaining predictive analytics to a room full of venture capitalists who hung on her every word. The familiar thrill of commanding expert attention had felt like coming home to herself, but it had also triggered anxiety about whether her marriage could survive her full professional presence. Richard, how are you handling Isabella's return to public prominence? It's an adjustment, he admitted, but watching her present to investors last week, I finally saw the woman I fell in love with, the confident, brilliant person who'd been hiding behind coffee service and dinner preparations. Their work wasn't finished. Trust, once broken, required daily reconstruction. But sitting in that therapy office, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that they could build something authentic together, based on who they actually were, rather than who they pretended to be.
The question now wasn't whether they could survive honesty, it was whether they could thrive because of it. 8 months later, Isabella stood at the podium of the Women in Tech conference, facing a room of 500 female entrepreneurs who'd gathered to hear her story. The San Francisco Convention Center hummed with anticipation as she adjusted the microphone, her confidence absolute in a way that would have been impossible during her years of voluntary invisibility. I spent 5 years pretending to be stupid, not because anyone forced me to, but because I was terrified that the man I loved wouldn't be able to handle the woman I actually was. In the audience, Richard watched with genuine pride that would have seemed impossible 8 months ago. His presence wasn't performative. He'd volunteered to attend, wanting to support her return to public prominence. The man who'd once dismissed her intelligence now served as her sounding board for strategic decisions, their partnership finally built on mutual respect rather than hidden power dynamics. The cost of that choice, Isabella continued, wasn't just my identity. It was the authentic relationship we could have built if I'd trusted him with the truth from the beginning. Catherine Stone nodded approvingly from the front row. Her investment had transformed Blackwell Strategic from a struggling consultancy into Silicon Valley's premier women's-focused business advisory firm. Isabella's public emergence had attracted clients who'd been underserved by traditional male-dominated consulting companies, creating a market niche neither she nor Richard had anticipated. Building genuine partnership requires dismantling the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about protection and sacrifice. I thought I was being generous by hiding my success. My husband thought he was being protective by shielding me from complicated business matters. We were both wrong. The audience stirred with recognition. Isabella's story had resonated across social media, sparking conversations about hidden achievements and suppressed potential in relationships worldwide. Marriage counselors reported increased appointments from couples confronting their own patterns of intellectual diminishment. Trevor, now COO of their expanded firm, managed operations while Isabella focused on strategic vision and Richard excelled at client relations. The three-way partnership had proven more effective than any of them had imagined, each person contributing their genuine strengths rather than performing expected roles. The question I'm asked most frequently, Isabella continued, is whether our marriage survived the revelation. The answer is more complex than yes or no. The marriage we had, built on deception and diminishment, died that night at our dinner table. What we built afterward was something entirely new. In the audience, Sophia Nakamura smiled with satisfied vindication. Her ultimatum had been the catalyst that forced Isabella's emergence from shadows, but the work of reconstruction required courage from both partners. She'd watched their painful growth with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd known Isabella's true potential all along. Partnership, Isabella said, building towards her conclusion, isn't about one person sacrificing their identity for the other's comfort. It's about both people being brave enough to show up authentically, even when that threatens the dynamics that feel familiar. Jasmine Harper, now managing strategic operations for 12 consulting teams, handled the logistics that allowed Isabella to travel as a speaker while maintaining their expanding client base. Her discretion during the revelation had earned her not just professional advancement, but genuine mentorship from a woman who understood the unique challenges facing ambitious women in male-dominated industries. My husband learned to value rather than diminish my intelligence. I learned to trust rather than protect. We discovered that authentic love requires the courage to be fully known, all of our strengths, all of our achievements, all of our capacity for greatness.
The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. As applause washed over her, Isabella caught Richard's eye across the crowded auditorium. His smile held no condescension, no insecurity, just the honest appreciation of a man who'd learned to celebrate rather than compete with his partner's success. After the conference, they walked hand in hand through San Francisco's financial district, past the buildings where Isabella had once commanded boardrooms, before choosing to disappear. Now she was visible again, not as Richard's hidden supporter, but as his equal partner in both business and life. Their success story wasn't about hidden power finally revealed. It was about two people learning to build something real together, founded on truth rather than comfortable lies. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but authentic, exactly as it should be. Isabella Rodriguez Blackwell closed her laptop, watching San Francisco's skyline through her corner office windows. The nameplate reading CEO Blackwell Strategic no longer felt foreign. 5 years had transformed the hidden genius into Silicon Valley's most sought-after strategic consultant. Richard entered carrying coffee, a gesture that once would have seemed patronizing, but now reflected genuine partnership. Their roles had evolved naturally. Isabella commanded strategy, while Richard excelled at client relationships, each amplifying the other's strengths rather than competing for dominance. "Emma's asking why Mommy gets interviewed on TV," he said with amused pride. Isabella smiled, thinking of their 3-year-old daughter who would grow up seeing authentic partnership modeled from birth. No fairy tales about diminished princesses in their household. Emma's bedtime stories featured queens who ran kingdoms while kings supported their vision. The Harvard Business Review article on her desk bore the headline, "The Hidden Genius: How One Woman's Revelation Transformed Partnership Dynamics." Her story had become required reading in business schools worldwide, sparking conversations about intellectual diminishment in relationships. Their company now employed 200 people, specializing in consulting for women-led startups. The waiting list for Isabella's personal guidance stretched 18 months. Brilliant women emerging from shadows, reclaiming voices they'd voluntarily silenced for love. "Dr. Chen wants to feature our 5-year data in her book," Richard added. Isabella nodded, remembering their early therapy sessions when every conversation felt dangerous. Now their weekly sessions served maintenance rather than crisis intervention. Through the window, the tech district hummed with ambition and possibility. But the real revolution happened quietly, one conversation at a time. Women learning to trust their partners with their full brilliance, marriages rebuilt on truth rather than comfortable lies. Isabella had discovered that the most powerful algorithm wasn't written in code. It was the courage to be authentically known and genuinely loved for exactly who you were. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.